January 5th, 1942. Tokyo was drowning in euphoria. Victory shouts echoed through the imperial capital streets as Admiral Yamamoto sat aboard his flagship, contemplating what came next. The architect of Pearl Harbor wasn't celebrating. While his staff officers reviewed glowing reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and a dozen other conquered territories, Yamamoto's mind was racing ahead to darker possibilities. He instructed his chief of staff to start planning the second phase of Pacific operations immediately. The deadline? Mid-February. Japan's military machine was moving faster than anyone had predicted. The conquest of the Western Pacific had been breathtaking. In just 4 weeks, Japanese forces had achieved what seemed impossible. American battleships lay broken at Pearl Harbor. British warships had been sent to the bottom of Malaya. Hong Kong had surrendered. Manila had fallen. The Dutch East Indies were next. But this spectacular success created a dangerous split within Japan's military leadership. The hardcore nationalists wanted to keep pushing forward, to strike while the iron was hot, consequences be damned. They didn't care how far the tentacles of empire stretched, as long as victory kept coming. Yamamoto represented a different faction entirely. He had never wanted this war. His opposition to fighting America and Britain had been so vocal that friends warned him he'd be assassinated if he stayed in Tokyo. That's partly why he commanded from sea, safely away from the fanatics in the capital. His chief of staff wrote in his diary about the desperate need for wise statesmanship now that the easy victories were piling up. Yamamoto understood something the politicians didn't. Japan couldn't win a long war against the West. It was that simple. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had met with an old friend, an ultranationalist leader, at the Imperial Navy Club. He laid it out plainly. War was coming because politicians had made it inevitable. At first, Japan would spread out like an octopus, tentacles reaching everywhere. They'd dominate. But this couldn't last. The moment Singapore fell, Yamamoto told his friend that would be the time for political action. The British would be shaken. India might revolt. Peace talks could begin. Japan needed to secure victory within a year and a half maximum. After that, the industrial might of America would crush them. Yamamoto knew the enemy intimately. He'd attended the London naval conferences in the 1930s. He'd served as naval attaché in Washington for years in the late 20s. He understood American capability and determination better than almost any Japanese officer. His strategy was clear: win big, win fast, then negotiate from strength before the sleeping giant fully awakened. By January 5th, the pieces seemed to be falling into place. Pearl Harbor had crippled the American battleship fleet. British capital ships were gone. The Philippines were nearly finished. But Yamamoto saw a critical flaw in the Pearl Harbor operation. The American aircraft carriers had escaped. They were out at sea during the attack, and now they represented a persistent, dangerous threat. What Japan needed was one more spectacular blow, something so devastating it would bring America to the negotiating table. The problem was deciding where to strike next. The army immediately shot down Yamamoto's suggestion to attack the Soviet Union. That would be a land war, and the army was already stretched thin in China and Southeast Asia. 3 other options emerged from the planning rooms. Yamamoto's personal favorite was an Indian Ocean campaign. Invade Ceylon, draw out and destroy the British Far Eastern Fleet just like he'd smashed the Americans at Pearl Harbor, then push into the Middle East to link up with German forces driving towards Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. It was bold, ambitious, and would secure oil supplies for Japan's navy indefinitely. The army rejected it outright. Too complex, too far from their current operations. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo favored a different approach: attack Australia. The idea was to cut off America's forward base in the Pacific. Japanese forces would sweep through the Solomon Islands, take New Guinea, then jump to New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Eventually, they'd occupy Australia and New Zealand. Planning staffs were already designing occupation governments for both countries. But Yamamoto wasn't sold. It would take too long, and it wasn't spectacular enough to shock America into negotiations. Yamamoto knew something the optimists in Tokyo didn't fully grasp. The Americans he'd lived among weren't the soft, incompetent people Japanese propaganda portrayed. Pearl Harbor had awakened something dangerous in them, a spirit of vengeance. The army kept insisting Americans were too weak to fight a real war, but Yamamoto had seen their industrial capacity firsthand. Even capturing Singapore wouldn't stop them. In January, Yamamoto ordered his staff to develop another plan. 2 months later, he dispatched officers to Tokyo carrying 2 documents: The first was the MI Plan, which detailed a major battle off Midway Island where American carriers would be lured out and destroyed. The second was the AL Plan, outlining an invasion of the North American continent through Alaska. If everything succeeded, Hawaii would fall next, possibly even parts of the West Coast. These victories would give Japanese politicians the leverage they needed for a favorable peace settlement. In Tokyo, admirals argued around conference tables in the Navy Ministry. The debates were fierce, but ultimately Yamamoto's prestige and force of will carried the day. His plans were approved. Nobody paid much attention anymore to the potential significance of Singapore's fall in February or the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor. Either of those might have served Yamamoto's purpose for peace negotiations, but they were forgotten in the excitement of planning new offensives. Then came April. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bombers appeared over Tokyo. The raid did minimal physical damage, but the psychological impact was enormous. Japanese leaders realized with shock that America wasn't defeated, wasn't demoralized, wasn't backing down. They were coming back, and they were coming for Japan itself. June brought catastrophe at Midway. 4 Japanese fleet carriers went to the bottom in a single day. The flower of Japan's naval aviation died in flames. The news was so devastating that it was suppressed. Only the highest levels of the Navy knew the full extent of the disaster. The Army wasn't told anything. Yamamoto's window for a spectacular victory had slammed shut. Now Japan faced the kind of grinding, attritional war he had always feared. While Yamamoto was suffering defeat at Midway, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had been steadily pushing south. Their target, Australia. The strategy was clear. Cut off Australia from America, and the entire South Pacific would fall into Japanese hands. They'd taken Rabaul back in January, turning it into a major air and naval base. From there, Japanese bombers struck constantly at New Guinea and surrounding islands. Australian commanders saw what was coming and warned General Douglas MacArthur, who had escaped from the Philippines in March. If the Japanese took New Guinea, northern Australia would be indefensible. The Japanese had already demonstrated their intent. They'd bombed Darwin in February. In March, they invaded Salamaua in New Guinea. In May, they sent an invasion force toward Port Moresby, but it was turned back in the carrier battle of the Coral Sea. Still, they occupied Tulagi north of Guadalcanal and built a seaplane base there. The momentum was clearly on Japan's side. MacArthur cabled Washington for reinforcements, 2 carriers and 1,000 planes. But Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, had grim news. Until the end of June, he'd have only 2 operational carriers in the entire Pacific. The Japanese had 10. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, had already warned about the big Japanese operation brewing, which turned out to be Midway. In late May, while Midway preparations consumed everyone's attention, Major General Tomataro Horii landed the South Seas Force at Salamaua. Naval troops occupied Lae and began building an airbase. The Imperial General Staff planned to press on toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, then resume the advance on Port Moresby by July. They expected Yamamoto's combined fleet to return victorious from Midway to support these operations. When Midway turned into disaster instead, the plans didn't change. Imperial headquarters simply lied to field commanders, reporting Midway as a victory. A few days after Midway, Australian intelligence informed MacArthur that the Japanese were preparing another offensive. MacArthur proposed a preemptive strike on the New Britain and New Ireland area, followed by an assault on Rabaul, the nerve center of Japanese operations in the region. He wanted his 2 carriers, 1,000 planes, and an amphibious division. With these forces, he'd drive the Japanese back to Truk. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, forwarded MacArthur's plan to Admiral King on June 12th with modifications: 3 carriers instead of 2, 1 Marine division, and 3 Army divisions. King rejected it immediately. He wasn't about to put MacArthur in command of naval forces. King also worried about exposing carriers to land-based air attack without adequate protection. Ironically, the Navy would face both these tactical problems at Guadalcanal anyway. King developed his own plan, a drive from the New Hebrides under Navy command. MacArthur objected strenuously to Army forces serving under the Navy, but nobody could deny the urgency. The Japanese had to be stopped before they reached New Guinea and positioned themselves to invade Australia. The question was who would command the operation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff split the operation into phases. Admiral King got Phase 1, taking the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions. Guadalcanal was barely a dot on the map, not even named specifically in the plan. It had no known tactical or strategic value. MacArthur would get Phase 2, mopping up the rest of the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea. King got his way because his plan required fewer resources, and he'd already established a defensive line down the Pacific to protect Australia. King had been planning ahead for months. He'd reinforced New Caledonia, Samoa, Ephrata in the New Hebrides. He'd convinced General Arnold to send Army Air Force squadrons to the region. He'd also made personnel changes. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose indecisiveness during the Wake Island crisis had annoyed King, was shipped off to a newly created amphibious training command in San Diego. There, Brown and Marine Major General Holland Smith would develop new techniques for island warfare. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, suggested a three-stage approach. First, hold the line in the South Pacific while training amphibious forces. Second, launch a combined offensive through the Solomons to the Bismarck Archipelago. Third, seize the Caroline and Marshall Islands. Fourth, drive either to the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. King approved the plan because it matched his own vision perfectly. King brought Vice Admiral Robert Gormley from London, where he'd been serving as naval observer, to command the South Pacific forces. He detached Turner from the plan's division and ordered him to prepare for command of the amphibious operation. All this happened even before the Japanese assaulted Port Moresby and Tulagi. Gormley left Washington on May 1st. He'd take command of South Pacific forces on June 19th, but first he had to report to Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. By the time Gormley reached Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive in the South Pacific was already rolling. On May 22nd, an Army plane spotted a Japanese photo reconnaissance aircraft photographing Guadalcanal. Army intelligence suggested the Japanese were planning to build an airfield there. On June 20th, intelligence reported that grass on the island's central plain had been burned off and tents were going up. A wharf was under construction at Lunga Point. 6 days later, an Australian coastwatcher on Guadalcanal reported that airfield construction was imminent, awaiting only the arrival of Japanese construction units. He even had their names, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, equivalent to American CB battalions. This was confirmed by radio intercepts at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz's radio intelligence group had broken parts of the Japanese naval code. They picked up a message saying the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive at their destination on July 4th. Admiral Turner was visiting Pearl Harbor that very day, en route to prepare for the amphibious landing somewhere in the South Pacific. When Nimitz received the intelligence report, Turner was right there. Within moments, he knew his destination. It couldn't be anywhere but the Solomons. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, New Zealand, aboard his flagship, the USS Macaulay, a converted Grace Line passenger ship. His mission was daunting: train an entire amphibious task force in 1 month. Nobody really knew how to conduct an opposed amphibious landing. The United States hadn't attempted one since the Spanish-American War nearly 44 years earlier. While Turner moved ships and men around, Admiral Gormley traveled to Melbourne to confer with MacArthur. Gormley's head was filled with gloomy thoughts about the operation's prospects. MacArthur, who had his own reasons for disliking the Navy's plan, agreed entirely. They both worried that available air power couldn't guarantee adequate air cover for the landing. This meeting occurred on July 18th. The landing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Gormley and MacArthur jointly sent a dispatch to Washington recommending the operation be postponed. Admiral King's response was swift and unambiguous: no. The invasion would proceed as scheduled. King had told Gormley from the beginning that he was being handed a difficult job and wouldn't get proper tools until perhaps the fall. But the Japanese couldn't be allowed more time to consolidate their position. The attack had to happen now. Gormley had left Washington convinced America wasn't ready for aggressive action in the South Pacific. His pessimism deepened when he failed to get CBs and other units sent immediately to New Zealand. The Guadalcanal invasion plan was marked by intelligence failures from the start. While various commands knew an operation was brewing, especially after July 10th when Nimitz sent Gormley his operations order, the intelligence reaching them was woefully inadequate. On July 10th, intelligence reports contained only casual comments about airfield construction on Guadalcanal. A few days later, reports placed the airfield on the wrong side of the island. By the end of July, the Japanese had completed the airfield. At Combined Fleet Headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto ordered the first staged mission from Rabaul for August 14th. As overall commander, Gormley desperately tried to secure more resources, advanced bases, additional aircraft, supplies. Everywhere he turned, he encountered the truth of King's warning about inadequate tools. Supply loading exemplified the problems. At Oakland, California, supplies for the invasion forces were loaded haphazardly aboard transports. Plenty of dock space existed to unload and reload properly, organizing supplies in the order of their intended use. Instead, the ships were sent to Noumea, which lacked such facilities. Everything had to be sorted out there, wasting precious time. King understood the difficulties at least in general terms, but delay wasn't an option. He knew better than any subordinate the absolute necessity of stopping the Japanese before they reached Australia. The timetable held firm. By late July, the rush was on. 7,700 Marines were moving by troopship from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea, and Samoa. Gormley was too busy to hold a commander's conference, but on July 28th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, designated tactical commander, called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. For the first time, tactical unit commanders gathered to discuss the invasion. Fletcher would protect the invasion with his carrier task force. Turner would deliver the troops. Marine General Alexander Van de Grift would command the landing forces. Once the Marines secured the island, garrison troops would be brought in. But nobody had arranged for reserve forces. No more troops were available in the entire South Pacific theater. The Saratoga meeting was not happy. Fletcher opened by announcing he'd protect the landings for only 2 days. He insisted the carriers mustn't be risked. Gormley's staff members at the meeting concurred. Fletcher was gun-shy, convinced the whole operation was cockeyed, hasty, and doomed to failure. Admiral Turner, who understood the global military picture better than anyone else present, challenged his superior. There was no point in defeatist arguments, he said. The decision had been made to take risks. Their job was carrying out orders. Fletcher should have understood this already. After the Coral Sea battle, Admiral King had been so displeased with Fletcher's constant avoidance of action that he insisted Nimitz determine the state of Fletcher's fighting spirit. Nimitz, a kindly man who liked Fletcher, had given him a pep talk. When Midway was won with Fletcher in command, he could hardly be faulted. But now, on the eve of America's first offensive operation, warning the troops he'd abandon them in 48 hours was a terrible beginning. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion was staged on July 28th near Coro Island in Fiji. It lasted 3 days and was a complete disaster. Only a third of assigned troops managed to get ashore, and when they did, they were confused about what to do next. General Van de Grift considered the exercise a total bust, but there was no time for a second attempt. On July 31st, the Marines reboarded transports and headed for Guadalcanal. On the afternoon of August 6th, as the task force of 75 ships neared the Solomons, Admiral Fletcher nervously broke away with his carriers. He'd have his planes over the landing force as promised, but the 26 ships of the carrier group were being taken as far from harm's way as possible. If American intelligence was faulty enough to miss Japanese airfield construction at Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence was worse. As the American invasion fleet massed in the South Pacific, the Japanese had no idea an attack was imminent. In July 1942, the Japanese army was preoccupied with capturing New Guinea as a staging point for operations against Australia and New Zealand. General Hori's South Seas Force had landed 2,000 troops near Buna. After capturing Buna, they planned to construct airfields as a prelude to a new attack on Port Moresby. Japanese air power concentrated against Port Moresby in July. Bombers and fighters swept over the piers and airfields nearly daily. The Japanese also supported their beachhead operations. Combined Australian and American air forces responded with raids on Japanese bases at Lae. During these preparations, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato was anchored in Japanese waters at Hashirajima. He was leisurely preparing for forthcoming air operations over Australia, then deciding what action to take next. On August 3rd, naval air groups stationed at Lae were brought back to Rabaul to prepare for Guadalcanal operations scheduled to begin the following week. During the first week of August, South Pacific skies were cloudy. Only a handful of Japanese search planes flew, and none found the American armada steaming toward Guadalcanal. Japanese airmen flying from Rabaul were surprised to encounter American carrier aircraft near Buna. They had been told American carriers were destroyed at Midway. The pilots assumed the carriers were operating with Australian forces. Actually, they were training for the Guadalcanal invasion. No one in Imperial High Command or in the field suspected a forthcoming invasion. After 8 months of continuous victories, it was hard for Japanese leaders to believe the Allies could launch a seaborne invasion. If the idea had been suggested, they would have agreed with MacArthur and Gormley that such an invasion had almost no chance of success. As the American expedition moved toward Guadalcanal, it enjoyed complete surprise. On August 4th and 5th, 75 ships steamed on under overcast skies. On August 6th, the fleet moved through rain squalls almost all day. But as dawn rose on August 7th, the sky cleared, giving carrier planes excellent visibility for their attacks. The fleet went to general quarters at 5:30. At 6 o'clock, the carriers launched their first strike. Planes from the Lost, Saratoga, and Enterprise were assigned targets on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese had established a seaplane base on Gavutu and Tanambogo, which were connected by a causeway. Japanese planes had been grounded the previous day by bad weather. Admiral Fletcher's task force reported one unidentified aircraft during the day, but whether it was Japanese or one of MacArthur's planes was undetermined. In any event, the Japanese weren't aroused until 6:12 on the morning of August 7th, when Tulagi's communications headquarters sent a frantic message announcing the attack. The radio message reached the 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleets, Admiral Yamamoto, and Imperial headquarters. It was simple and succinct: enemy heavy bombardment in progress. Weather had cleared, and carrier planes flew into scattered cumulus clouds in the light of a quarter moon. Fighters and bombers moved toward their assigned missions. 8 fighters led by Lieutenant Low Powers took off from the Enterprise to attack Guadalcanal, targeting aircraft, PT boats, troop installations, and supply dumps. They found no aircraft and no PT boats. They strafed buildings on the airfield at Lunga Point. Meanwhile, another 8 Enterprise fighters maintained combat air patrol over the transport ships from 6 until 8 o'clock, when they were replaced by others. Bombers began hitting Tulagi and the Lunga Point area, but no enemy air activity was seen all morning. The Americans had it entirely to themselves. The only planes damaged were those hurt in operational accidents. Planes from other carriers struck the seaplane base at Gavutu. The surprise was absolute. American planes arrived and began bombing and strafing seaplanes in the water. They destroyed 9 float planes similar to the Zero, 1 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 seaplanes that doubled as search planes and bombers. A few Japanese pilots tried to take off, but were shot down before getting airborne. Not a single Japanese plane at Gavutu survived the attack. Other carrier planes hit Japanese troop concentrations on Tulagi. Some struck targets on beaches the Marines would soon invade. Before dawn, Marines on transport decks could see the high mountains of their objective island. The transport slipped through the narrow passage between Guadalcanal and Savo Islands into Sea Lark Channel. As dawn rose, guns from escorting warships fired, and flashes of light illuminated the fleet. There was virtually no answering fire. Bombardment from cruisers and destroyers accompanying the troopships started fires along shore. An oil dump exploded, sending flames leaping into the sky. At 8 o'clock, after 2 hours of bombing and shelling, landing craft began moving toward the north shore east of Lunga Point. The Marines were nervous. Neither they nor their officers had practical experience in such landings. This was America's first amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War. At 9 o'clock, troops were landing on Guadalcanal. They met no resistance because the Japanese had fled into the hills. The going was ridiculously easy. Marines soon saw how completely they'd surprised the enemy. They came across wooden barracks never slept in. They found a tent with a breakfast table full of platters and bowls of meat, rice, and cooked plums. Half-filled rice bowls were scattered around, chopsticks hastily dropped on tables or straw mats. The tents themselves told why the Japanese had left so rapidly. They were torn by shrapnel, some knocked flat by naval shelling before the landing. But any Marine feeling like celebrating over the ease of early objectives had shocks coming. It was true the Japanese on Guadalcanal had been surprised and hadn't dug in yet or created permanent fortifications. Most of the men were construction troops, not fighting men. But over on Tulagi, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines encountered stout resistance. About 250 Japanese were located on Tulagi. They were troops of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment under Captain Shigetoshi Miyazaki. They were experienced and dedicated fighters. Edson's 1st Raiders were the toughest American troops in the Pacific. They were all volunteers chosen from the ranks of a force known for fighting qualities. The raider concept came from Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's recommendation for creation of a commando force. Carlson's experience included service with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army and its guerrilla struggles against the Japanese in North China. Edson's raiders had trained for months under Spartan conditions. When they came to Guadalcanal, they already had a powerful reputation. As it turned out, they'd need every trick they've learned and would learn new ones. This invasion was the first contact between highly trained American troops and seasoned Japanese veterans since the war began in December. The Japanese had a reputation even more fearsome than the raider battalions, gained through phenomenally rapid marches through the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies. For months, Tokyo had crowed over victories, and half the world believed the Japanese were invincible. Imperial High Command was pleased to encourage this reputation. Tulagi, then, was in a sense the first testing ground. Edson's troops landed at 8:15 on the northwestern part of the island. At the beginning, the going didn't seem much harder than on Guadalcanal. They encountered resistance from a few outposts. The northwest part of Tulagi was covered with thick jungle, small trees, vines, and bougainvillea with its beautiful leaves and sharp thorns. At first, terrain seemed the worst obstacle. Edson lost only one man, and that to a sniper, as the Marines hit the beach. Edson planned to move inland to a ridge running the length of the island, then work along the ridge top, clearing slopes as they moved south. But terrain was so difficult it took 3 hours to chop through 1.5 miles of rising ground. Having reached the ridge line, Marines moved ahead, came out of the jungle, and ran straight into central Japanese defenses built on the hillside. The Japanese had constructed dugouts and rock emplacements and positioned machine guns carefully to create interlocking fields of fire. Japanese defense was based on keeping the enemy below them, but Marines found that by crawling up cliffs, they could drop dynamite charges and grenades into dugouts. That was the method they had to use to advance. Once a dugout was blown, it still wasn't safe. In one hole, Americans killed 17 Japanese with dynamite charges. One Marine spotted a radio inside and went in to retrieve it. 2 Japanese soldiers were still alive. They shot him and another man who came after him before being killed. One section of Marines took on the defense position in the island's center, while the center and left flank of Edson's force pushed down the ridge. Even along the ridge line, the going wasn't easy. One company suffered 15% casualties that first afternoon. Frontal resistance was stiff, but with the Japanese, frontal resistance was only half the battle. Snipers seemed everywhere, tied in trees, in the tops of buildings, behind rocks. A favorite sniper tactic was letting the forward element of a Marine unit pass, then shooting men from behind. This move almost always meant death for the sniper, but usually not before he'd caused several casualties. One thing the first raiders learned that day was that small .25 caliber Japanese rifle and machine gun slugs were more apt to wound and kill. From the Japanese point of view, this was satisfactory, since it took additional troops and resources to care for wounded. During the afternoon, raiders drove along the ridge until they ran into a 3-sided ravine whose floor was an old British cricket field. The Japanese had dug into ravine walls and established crossfire fields that would become so familiar in later months. As Marines moved up, they ran into devastating crossfire. Edson stopped because darkness was coming, and this was no time to probe unknown dangers. That night, Marines on Tulagi had another new experience. The Japanese, knowing they were outnumbered with no chance of survival, staged one of the death-desperate counterattacks for which they'd become infamous. They waited until the Marine perimeter was quiet, then at 10:30 broke through between 2 companies and surrounded one of them. Marines fought in foxholes and in the open using rifles, machine guns, grenades, and knives. The Japanese came along the ridge toward Colonel Edson's command post and reached a point 50 yards from him. Finally, Marines overpowered the Japanese and threw them back, but not before one company had lost half its non-commissioned officers. The next day, August 8th, more troops landed on Tulagi until there were 7,500 on that side of Sea Lark Channel. Edson's raiders and men of the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines began moving again toward the southeastern end of the island. One by one, they attacked dug-in machine gun positions on steep sides of the old cricket ground. From one cave, they removed 35 dead Japanese, some already rotting and stinking, but some killed in the last moment of defending the position. From this, Americans deduced properly that Japanese tactics involved holding a position until the last unless ordered to retreat. Proof of the discipline of Japanese armed forces. Those troops who surrendered on Guadalcanal were mostly members of labor battalions, not combat troops. Raiders that second day encountered dozens of examples of a spirit they hadn't seen before. In one dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers who at the end had only one loaded pistol among them. As Marines prepared the final assault, they heard 3 shots. When they entered the dugout, they discovered 3 bodies and an empty pistol. One officer had fired all but his last 3 rounds, then shot his 2 companions and himself. In those first days, this suicidal attitude surprised Marines. It was hard for Americans to understand how cornered or wounded men with no hope of survival, knowing the enemy had enormous material and numerical advantage, would almost invariably choose death over surrender. It took getting used to, but after a few Japanese pretended to surrender only to pull out guns or bayonets to attack their captors, or explode grenades to kill themselves and their enemies, Marines took the Japanese on their own terms. Thereafter, there was virtually no further attempt to persuade Japanese soldiers to surrender. Tulagi was brought under control on that second day, although not all Japanese on the island had been killed. For days afterward, Japanese snipers harassed American troops until the last sniper was killed. One gets a feel for the stubbornness of fighting on Tulagi in the experience of gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss. He'd gone ahead of his men to attack a cave near the cricket field. The Japanese had fired sporadically from that position. He moved close enough to throw hand grenades into the cave. Marines had been trained to pull the pin of the egg-shaped grenade, throw, count slowly, and hear the explosion. Sergeant Goss pulled the pin, threw, and counted. On 6, the grenade was lobbed back out of the cave, and he had to duck to escape the blast of his own weapon. After another identical experience, he held the grenade for 3 seconds, then threw. 4, 5, 6, and out it came again. Sergeant Goss called for a satchel charge, a bag filled with dynamite usually used to blow buildings. He thrust in the charge, primed it, and ran back a little. The Japanese thrust the charge out of the cave mouth. The dynamite exploded and drove a rock splinter into Goss's leg. The wound wasn't serious enough to stop him, but it hurt enough to infuriate him. He picked up his submachine gun and dashed into the cave, spraying fire. He killed 4 Japanese soldiers and counted 8 others who died earlier. If possible, the fighting on Gavutu and Tenambogo was worse than Tulagi. Landings there came mid-morning. Not many troops were committed because no one expected to find many Japanese there. But since the seaplane base was on these islands, the Japanese had fortified them heavily, and Marines ran into trouble. The Japanese were surprised and still hadn't recovered from bombardment and aerial attack that destroyed their seaplanes. So the first troops ashore were met by rifle fire only. But when the second wave of Marines reached the beach, the Japanese had organized about 500 yards back, and fire was intense. The third wave came under fire before landing craft reached shore, and casualties were heavy. Gavutu and Tenambogo were both dominated by small hills not quite 150 feet high, but above sea level landings. This height was enough. The Japanese had built defenses along the slopes and were well supplied with machine guns, automatic rifles, and ammunition. As on Tulagi, each Japanese position had to be taken. They didn't retreat. The viciousness of fighting on Tenambogo was almost unbelievable. In early waves, Marines had landed tanks. The Japanese came surging toward the Tenambogo dock where landings had been made. They jammed crowbars under treads, threw grenades, and tried to set tanks afire with gasoline-soaked rags. One tank commander opened the hatch and employed the tank's machine gun to kill 23 Japanese soldiers before one scrambled up the tank's side and stabbed him to death with a bayonet. Another Japanese then threw gasoline-soaked rags inside the tank, and it burned. By mid-afternoon on this first day, it was apparent Marines could use reinforcements. A unit that had landed earlier on Florida Island, where there were no Japanese, was called over to assist. Tenambogo had been taken, but Marines were unable to secure the causeway linking the 2 small islands. Reinforcements were ordered to Tenambogo, and at dusk were given 5 minutes of preparatory bombardment from naval vessels. Unluckily, one of the last shells hit a fuel dump near the beach and lit up the shore as if it were noon. As Marines came up, the Japanese had them clearly silhouetted against the sea. From dugouts on hills came a steady stream of machine gun and rifle fire. 2 boatloads of Marines reached the beach, but the coxswain of the third boat was killed at his tiller. The boat slewed around and headed back out to sea. Following boats did the same, believing there'd been some change in orders. So men from 2 boats were stranded ashore, and their only protection was the concrete pier. The Japanese were firing. As soon as Americans returned fire, the Japanese spotted the position by the tracers. Soon several men were down. 1 boat retired, taking wounded, and it was some time before confusion was eliminated and other boats began landing. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched a counterattack on the beach. Captain Crane, the unit leader, was cut off from his boat. He and 5 men hid in brush, and in darkness they escaped to return to the beach after the Japanese had drawn back to hillside positions. Eventually, they were extricated, but it was 4 in the morning of August 8th before another unit landed and secured the causeway. When fighting started, there were 500 Japanese on the connecting islets of Gavutu and Tenambogo. When fighting ended, there were none. Early on the morning of August 7th, the Tulagi radio station flashed first word of the United States assault to Rabaul. The astounding news reached Rabaul airfield just as pilots of early morning missions were preparing to take off for another day's harassment of Australians on New Guinea. Orders were immediately cancelled, and all available planes were dispatched to strike the American invasion force. Before planes could take off, they received unwelcome news from Tulagi. The entire flying boat flotilla had been destroyed. Then contact with Tulagi was broken, which could only mean the base there had been overrun. At 8:30, a flight of 27 twin-engine Betty bombers took off from Rabaul. They'd been loaded for the strike against Australian forces on New Guinea, so they carried bombs instead of torpedoes. 18 fighters accompanied them. They climbed to 13,000 feet, flew east to Buka Island, and turned south along the Bougainville coast. They were picked up by 4 Enterprise planes just after 1 in the afternoon. The Enterprise fighters were flying at 18,000 feet, when down below they spotted the large formation of Betty bombers escorted by Zeros just above Florida Island. The Wildcats attacked. Lieutenant Vincent Powers shot down 1 bomber. 4 others began smoking and were listed as probables. But after this initial run, Zeros joined the fight, and the Wildcats broke off to take refuge in cloud cover as they'd been instructed. They'd been hard hit. 1 Wildcat had been shot down, and Lieutenant Powers' plane was so badly shot up he had to make an emergency landing on the Wasp. Lieutenant Gregory Fairbanks led another flight of 6 fighters from the Enterprise. They found the enemy off Santa Isabel Island. The Zeros came in fast, 10 of them, and attacked 3 of the fighters. All 3 Wildcats were shot down. The other 3 American fighters attacked the bombers. Ensign Russell Raines shot down 1 Betty. The first kill of a Zero was made by radio electrician Thomas Rhodes. But the Zeros came after them in force, and the Wildcats ducked into clouds to hide. There were 10 Zeros after them in 2 formations, and they came in observing the Japanese rule: never let your wingman out of sight. They attacked the Wildcats from the starboard quarter. Lieutenant Fairbanks, enlisted pilot William Stevenson Jr., and pilot machinist William Warden were shot down. One of the coast watchers picked up Fairbanks from the water off Santa Isabel Island. A Guadalcanal coast watcher sent a canoe to rescue Warden off that same island, but Stevenson wasn't found. Aboard the other carriers, the story was much the same. The bombers were much easier targets. 6 fighters of Fighting 323 ran into enemy bombers off Lunga Point and shot down 4 of them. Machinist Donald Runyon destroyed 2 single-handedly. Just after 2:30 in the afternoon, when Japanese Betty bombers and Zero fighters began their run over the island, coast watchers were on alert. Paul Edward Mason, a copper planter in peacetime, was stationed on Malabita Hill on Bougainville overlooking Ben. At 9 in the morning, he sent a message that 24 Japanese bombers were heading toward Guadalcanal. They were still 400 miles, or 2¼ hours, away from the target when that message was broadcast back from Pearl Harbor to the fleet. That message reached the invasion fleet in plenty of time for preparations. The reaction of HMAS Canberra, one of the Australian cruisers, was typical. When the word came, the bosun's mate piped the message: the ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 1100. And the torpedo bombers came in right on schedule. United States fighters climbed above them to 20,000 feet as the bombers reached the north shore of Guadalcanal and looked down on the invasion fleet. At noon, American carrier fighters and guns of ships were ready for them. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese were feeling the results of American counterattack. American fighter planes were quite effective against the twin-engine bombers. Of the 24 Bettys that finally arrived over Guadalcanal, all but 1 was shot down. The only damage sustained in that first attack was to the destroyer Mugford, which was hit by a bomb. Against the Zero fighters, however, it was a different story. Pilot Officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading ace, was among 18 chosen for their skill to make this first long-range mission over the target. The Japanese force was jumped by Wildcats from the carriers, and they went straight for the bombers, ignoring the Zeros. The Zeros protected the bombers as well as they could, but then turned to the American fighters. Sakai was puzzled by American tactics. Navy pilots dove against the Zeros, but if they missed on the first pass, they scattered and evaded. They'd been instructed well by intelligence officers who knew the Zero was superior in turning and climbing ability as well as faster. After a grim and skillful battle, Sakai shot down one Wildcat, and an SBD dive bomber that by itself had jumped 4 Zeros. Several other Japanese pilots made kills while 1 Zero was lost. Pilot Sakai attacked a group of SBD torpedo bombers, thinking they were fighters, and ran straight into 4 spitting machine guns manned by rear gunners who had him caught as he came in. His Zero was badly smashed, and he was seriously wounded, yet he managed to fly the plane back to Rabaul and land before collapsing. In the air, the Japanese still had a temporary advantage in the quality of the Zero, but already the Americans in their Wildcats were beginning to learn to use the limitations of the enemy to their advantage. The matter of control of the air was obviously going to be hotly contested. At this particular moment, the Americans had the advantage of proximity with carriers close offshore, but the Japanese had the advantage of numbers at Rabaul. The American effort was seriously hampered by the superiority of Japanese Zeros over American fighters. Carrier pilots were flying the Wildcat, which wasn't as fast or maneuverable as the Zero. The Japanese could fly rings around them. The one advantage of the Wildcat was its sturdy construction and armor protection, all that was needed to keep the ratio of lost planes as low as it was. At Rabaul, the Japanese recovered rapidly from the surprise of the American invasion, but the problem for Japanese fighters was the 1,100-mile round trip. For that reason, on the first day, Commander Nakajima, leader of the fighter squadron, had resisted demands by higher authority that all Zeros available be sent into the fight. He dispatched only his most experienced flyers. He was soon sending others, and losses grew more serious, largely because of vast distances to be traversed. By nightfall of the first day, the United States invasion seemed secure. American troops had moved up near the airfield and hadn't encountered substantial resistance. One prisoner was captured who indicated there were only about 600 combat troops on the island and 1,400 laborers, and that they'd fled to the opposite side. Admiral Turner had moved 11,000 Marines ashore, and vast piles of ammunition, food, and other supplies crowded the beaches. General Vandegrift had noticed the beach force was unable to assimilate the supplies, but fearing the carriers would soon move out, he was glad to see supplies still coming. He established a second beachhead, but it was soon crowded as badly as the first. At 8:40 on the morning of August 8th, Coast Watcher Jack Reed at Buka Passage spotted 45 Japanese dive bombers that had taken off from Kavieng. 30 minutes later, Pearl Harbor repeated the broadcast to the ships. Carrier planes attacked and destroyed many of the enemy bombers, but on this day, United States ships didn't escape unscathed. A blazing bomber dove into the deck of the transport George F. Elliott and set it afire. One dive bomber sent a torpedo into the destroyer Jarvis, putting it out of action. That morning, pilots of the Enterprise and other carriers took off on their missions and found the skies clear. They strafed and bombed troop concentrations along the Tenerife River and worked over the airfield again. At about 10 o'clock, 3 fighters from the Enterprise discovered a group of Japanese torpedo bombers coming in low over the water's surface to attack the transports. The Americans jumped them. Machinist Runyon shot down 1 bomber and 1 fighter. Ensign Vernon Rouse shot down 2 twin-engine torpedo bombers. Ensign John Shoemaker shot down another. That was the end of air activity for the day. At nightfall, Enterprise Fighting 6 counted its losses. 6 pilots shot down by Zeros. The Japanese Zero fighters still had the edge and experience in aircraft, but American pilots were already beginning to learn tricks of the trade. The commander of the Enterprise Air Group concluded the Zero had 2 major weaknesses: limited firepower and inability to withstand punishment. Because of the Zero's superior rate of climb, maneuverability, and fuel capacity, Wildcat pilots were warned to stick close together. When attacked, each 2-plane element should set up a scissors movement, constantly turning toward each other. Thus the pair of Wildcats could concentrate their superior firepower on the enemy, while knowing their own planes could absorb enormous punishment. On the ground, Marines fought fierce Japanese opposition on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tenambogo. On Tulagi, they suffered 90 casualties but took control of the island by the end of the second day. The Japanese garrison of 250 men fought to the end. 200 men were killed, 3 surrendered, and the rest swam the strait to Florida Island to continue fighting. On Gavutu and Tenambogo, Marines suffered 250 casualties. The 500-man Japanese garrison was wiped out to the last man. The fierceness of this fighting on Tulagi was in sharp contrast with the easy advance of Marines on Guadalcanal. There, on the morning of August 8th, Marines reached the edge of the airport they would name Henderson Field after a flyer killed at Midway. They were beginning to develop contempt for the enemy. "I wish those fucking Japanese would come out and fight," one Marine said within hearing of Richard Tregiscus, the International News Service correspondent who'd accompanied the invasion. "All they do is run into the jungle. On the surface, Marines couldn't ask for a finer war, but officers were edgy that second afternoon. It was too easy. At sea, the Americans apparently had no opposition either. A few Japanese patrol craft, tenders, and 1 or 2 transports had been caught offshore and destroyed in the first hours of invasion by shelling and bombing. Only in the air were the Japanese giving the Americans pause. Most of those first waves of bombers were destroyed, but the cost of meeting the Zeros was 21 of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier planes. That loss, not high by operational standards, convinced Fletcher his decision to withdraw was sound. At 6 o'clock that evening, Fletcher asked Admiral Gormley to allow him to withdraw his carriers. He withdrew before he had a reply. When Admiral Turner intercepted Fletcher's dispatch, he realized carrier withdrawal would leave him without any air cover. The number of Japanese planes could be expected to increase sharply as the enemy brought down more aircraft through the island chain. As Fletcher began to withdraw, the Japanese were moving in force. When the word invasion had been flashed from Guadalcanal to Rabaul, Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa had reacted immediately. Admiral Mikawa was commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet and the Outer South Seas Force, which meant he had responsibility for the whole South Pacific operation. His first move was to load 6 small transports with troops and dispatch them with destroyer escort to reinforce the 2,000-man Guadalcanal garrison. But the convoy ran into the American submarine S-38, which was operating out of Australia following the fall of the Philippines. The S-38 sank the transport Mayon Maru with 342 men aboard. The sinking, coupled with reports of the enormous American invasion flotilla, persuaded the admiral it was too dangerous at the moment to try to reinforce the garrison, and he called back the other 5 transports. By that time, Japanese naval assistance was already on the way to Guadalcanal. Admiral Mikawa had been lucky in the matter of timing. Early on the morning of August 7th, as the Tulagi garrison sent its last message, 5 heavy cruisers left cavying on the northern tip of New Ireland. 3 of them were headed northeast for Manus Island in the Admiralty Group, and 2 were bound for Rabaul. Admiral Mikawa soon ordered all 5 cruisers to hasten to Rabaul. Shortly after noon, the cruiser Chokai, accompanied by a destroyer, moved into Simpson Harbor. The other 4 cruisers waited in St. George's Channel between New Ireland and New Britain for the Chokai to rejoin. When she came up late that afternoon, she was carrying Admiral Mikawa himself and was accompanied by the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari. So the Japanese moved toward Guadalcanal with 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. As they sped south, Admiral Mikawa composed his battle plan. By cutting speed, they could delay arrival until after midnight on August 8th and make a surprise night attack on American forces at the beachhead. The admiral knew the Americans had several carriers in the area, while he had none. A night attack was a guarantee he wouldn't be harassed by American planes, since the Americans had no record of proficiency in night aerial operations. In fact, the Americans had no record of competence in any sort of night naval operations, while this aspect of tactics had become a Japanese specialty. Mikawa's problem that afternoon was how to move close to Guadalcanal without coming in too soon and still not give away the element of surprise. He had to attack to support the Guadalcanal defenders, but if he could surprise the enemy, the effectiveness would be enormous. The admiral didn't know it just then, but the nature of divided command, the inferiority of the American air intelligence system, and the lack of clearly defined search methods would all play directly into his hands. For intelligence about Japanese ship movements, Americans at Guadalcanal had to depend on air search and submarine reports. Only under the most special circumstances would reports of coast watchers be of much use concerning naval ship operations. Early in the day, the cruisers were sighted by United States B-17 Army bombers as they moved down toward Rabaul. On the evening of August 7th, the Mikawa force was sighted by the S-38 just as it came out of St. George's Channel. That night, the commander of the S-38 reported the contact to Brisbane. But those 2 reports weren't given much credence by American naval commanders because Rabaul had become the Japanese Navy's forward base, and it was quite normal for ships to move in and out. The Americans saw no indication the ships in question were steaming toward Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley was responsible for coordination of all elements of the American attack, but to secure air searches, he had to depend on several sources. First were the long-range B-17 bombers of General MacArthur's American Army Air Force and the Australian Army Air Force, part of MacArthur's command, which operated independently. Second was Admiral McCain's land-based Naval Air Force, which included a number of seaplane tenders and PBY patrol bombers. General MacArthur's planes were to take responsibility for search of the Bismarck Islands, concentrating on the big naval and air base at Rabaul. McCain was to watch the northern approaches to the region, which meant Truk and the Marshalls. Admiral Fletcher's carrier planes were supposed to make short-range searches, but actually made none at all. Fletcher was bemused with his worries. Admiral Turner had looked at his charts and seen that the Japanese had a marvelous approach to the island of Guadalcanal along the west coast of Bougainville, straight down between Choiseul Island and Vella La Vella, past Columbangara, between New Georgia and Santa Isabel, and then between Florida Island and Guadalcanal's north coast. The lane was christened the Slot. Soon it would become infamous in American naval history. On the morning of August 8th, 4 PBYs were scheduled to fly from Denny on a 700-mile long triangular pattern whose apex was the Fiji Islands. They'd come up almost due west of the Santa Cruz Islands. 6 PBYs would fly search patterns from Espiritu Santo northeast over the Santa Cruz Islands and end at a point slightly above the Bismarcks, but far to the west of the Japanese task force. 6 PBYs would spread out from Maleta across the Slot from Guadalcanal to search an area north and west of the Slot. 3 B-17s were to search north of Guadalcanal. On the night of August 7th, when Admiral Turner studied the search plan for the following day, he found the Slot was completely uncovered. He asked Admiral McCain for a special search there the next day, but somehow, between Admiral Turner's flagship, Admiral McCain's headquarters, and the seaplane Tender Mackinac at Maleta, the message was lost. The search was never made. Thus, on August 8th, the Americans had left uncovered the most obvious approach of any enemy naval force to Guadalcanal. The Japanese were coming, and nobody knew it.